Hello and welcome to The Home Experience, a podcast where two nerds discuss movies and TV shows currently available on the home market. I'm Adam Barnard.
And I'm Jackson Smith.
And today we're going to be talking about the Book of Henry. Well, we're going to get into the main discussion very soon, but first I want to give a big congratulations to my co-host Jackson Smith, who survived his trial by fire with the first podcast last week with The Last Jedi. How's it feel, Jackson?
It feels good. To all you listening out there, I promise I will say a lot less this time around.
Well, Jackson, you've done a great job, and it's been really exciting to get to talk in a different way. I know we have so many discussions. I mean, the hours we've logged from when we first met till now, discussing and cultivating our own analysis of movies is too many to count. And so I'm really enjoying so far the Screen Fever channel and being able to do this podcast and also have other discussions about current titles that we'd probably be talking about anyways, even if we weren't doing this.
Yeah, that's part of the reason we decided to do Book of Henry today. This is a movie that we've both been very vocal about on both sides of the spectrum. It's a movie whose production history we've been very fascinated in. And because we're both filmmakers and because we both come from an industry background, this is a very specifically interesting movie to talk about because why it works and why it doesn't work in turn both have to do with who was involved with it and how it sort of came about. And as a filmmaker and as somebody who loves this industry, that's what I really find fascinating.
Right. And this is something that I think highlights some of the more interesting elements of filmmaking because you have the critics who absolutely maligned this movie.
They really did.
Some of the stuff they've written is incredibly vicious on a personal level as well as creative criticism. And it also highlights how audiences and filmmakers and critics all view the same story differently. And that's something that I can understand why this film is very much outside the realm of certain people's sensibilities. And I think it's one of the few stories that has so much subjectivity to it because the amount of reactions people have had from good to bad to in between is just staggeringly different. Yeah,
Colin Trevorrow, who directed this movie, is an interesting director. We haven't seen too much from him yet, but I think for better or for worse, this is the kind of movie where you can really see a strong passion for filmmaking and a strong passion for using film as a language to communicate ideas. In this director, the extent to which he succeeds is debatable, and we will definitely be debating that, but it's certainly worth noting, and it's certainly a movie that I feel should be discussed and should be discussed at length, which is what we're going to do today.
This story, it's about me, my brother, my mom, and the girl who lived next door.
Henry and Peter, they're lucky to have you.
And your father's lucky to have you too.
Stepfather. Mom,
I have to tell you something, and it's very important. Christine is in trouble. When someone hurts someone else, we have to make it better. There's only one way to stop it. I'd hope to do it all myself, but that's not an option.
There has to be another way to help Christina. Why there's no way to help. Come to this door and wait.
The Book of Henry is directed by Colin Trevorrow and written by Greg Hurwitz. It is currently available on most home markets and HBO Go. The film follows Henry, an 11-year-old child genius living in upstate New York with his younger brother and his mother, Susan. And Henry discovers that his next-door neighbor is being abused by her stepfather, a revelation that leads him on a journey to set things right, further complicated by the revelation that he has brain cancer. It's a very interesting movie with a very interesting production history. So, Adam, can you tell us a little bit about how this thing came about?
Yeah, originally this was supposed to be a follow-up to director Colin Trevorrow's debut feature called Safety Not Guaranteed. Safety Not Guaranteed was a very small, like $750,000 indie sci-fi character drama that absolutely exploded after it went to Sundance in 2012. And this was supposed to be Trevorrow's follow-up, but like I said, Safety was so good that it got the attention of big studio or big production company titans like Spielberg or Frank Marshall or Kathy Kennedy or Brad Bird. So Trevorrow immediately got drafted into Jurassic Park 4, into directing Jurassic Park 4, which became Jurassic World. And Book of Henry, there was no time to do a second film. So cut to a couple years later, Trevorrow's wrapping up post on Jurassic World. He starts to re-enter negotiations to do the Book of Henry because this is kind of his second passion project. This is always what he wanted to do because he likes doing original material and indie films, but somehow he keeps getting drafted into big budget fare. And again, after Jurassic, what happened is he got drafted into Star Wars Episode 9, which left really no gap to do the films he was wanting to do after Jurassic. So he had to pick one and he had to do it fast. And he picked Book of Henry, and they shot it right after the kind of press circuit debut of Jurassic happened in the summer. They shot it, in the fall in upstate New York. But this movie ultimately kind of complicated his career and his street cred due to the way it was received, unfortunately.
Yeah, it should also be noted too that Greg Hurwitz who's a novelist, a popular novelist, wrote the script almost 20 years ago, I think. So this thing had been being passed around and was sitting in the can for a while. I mean, it's unfortunate that this happened to Trevorrow because I do think he's a really talented director. And I think this movie.
Be careful of the film nerds. Be careful. Don't say that. You're gonna get roasted, buddy.
I think there's a lot. I think we'll get into it later, but I think there's a lot of like really, really admirable stuff in this movie, at least from a directorial standpoint. But we'd be naive to deny that this did not have a positive impact on his career and probably didn't help the debacle with, being let go of for Episode 9.
Yeah. And to clarify the story behind that, from what I've heard and from what the press has reported, this was not the reason he was fired from Episode 9. The reason was development wasn't working out. Carrie Fisher had died. They had to scrap the story and start fresh very late in the game. They were having difficulties about, spoilers here, but difficulties dealing with Luke Skywalker's death and other chips on the table. And at this point, getting fired from a Star Wars movie isn't necessarily a condemnation as a bad director.
That's
there
true.
are plenty of people at this point who have been let go, even almost at the end or after production of their Star Wars movie. So it's kind of like a rite of passage at this point for some of the younger filmmakers to get screwed over by a big franchise. But I will say this movie did call into question whether Trevorrow was given the keys to too many kingdoms too quickly before he had a chance to even, become a prolific filmmaker.
To establish his voice, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like at that point, Safety is a great movie, and it clearly came from a filmmaker, but you need several movies to establish your voice as a filmmaker. Rian Johnson, for example, who directed Last Jedi, had 3 features under his belt. And I guarantee you, if Brothers Bloom came out right before Last Jedi, the conversation around Last Jedi would have been pretty similar.
I didn't even think of that.
I kind of like Brothers Bloom too.
I do too.
I know it's a weird movie, and it's a weird movie in a similar way to Book of Henry weirdness.
What's super interesting is that Trevorrow has said very vocally in many interviews that he doesn't necessarily agree with his own ascension, which he mostly said this before he got let go of Star Wars because he wanted to be self-aware, and he said, look, I'm glad I have this. I'm going to do my best, but I don't know if I agree with filmmakers being immediately thrust into directing, having these franchises like Godzilla or Kong or Jurassic or Star Wars, before they've really develop their craft. Trevorrow's experience directing pre-Jurassic was 6 weeks doing a small feature. That's it. And like you said, Safety has such a strong voice. When he wants to be, he's very intentional with story choices and characters and a lot of different kinds of subversion, which I'm really excited to get into later. But it's kind of like a bit of a tragedy. It's just a downer because a lot of these young filmmakers come in with such passion and kind of get chewed up by a very rigorous development process and almost lose some of their beautiful individuality that they had in their debut work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about the history of this movie, but I'm curious, Adam, what did you think of the movie itself?
Right. So the movie itself, I actually didn't get to see it until it was on the whole market, believe it or not. I loved 70 or 80% of it so much. I loved the aesthetic. I loved the casting. I mean, the actors and their performances are spellbinding at times. Like Jaden Lieberher and Jacob Tremblay. My God, like I cried like 3 times in this movie because of him. And Naomi Watts really carried the last half of the movie with her charisma. But yeah, when the 20% of it came around that didn't work, it was just like this. The wind fell out of the sail. The sails just shrunk in the wind, and then just halts to a standstill, and you just feel like someone forgot how to continue the story.
Yeah, no, I saw this thing in theaters, so I saw it kind of before all the hype came around, and I would say I'm around the 60% scale. I think, like I said, I think Trevorrow's got a lot of strengths as a filmmaker, and I think one of his strengths is taking genre and subverting it. So
absolutely,
as I said, this movie is very much meant to emulate the aesthetic and feel of a, your standard genius precocious child movie. But in actuality, it plays very different. So Henry, instead of being sort of this naive, wonder child, is this smart, grounded, almost patriarchal figure in his family.
Right.
Whereas the mom, played by Naomi Watts, is sort of the child. She plays video games. She goes out drinking with her friends, And after Henry dies of brain cancer, the movie very much becomes about her coping with his death, but it plays out in the way a movie would about a child coping with a parent's death. So you kind of have that movie, but with the roles flipped around. And the first half does a really good job of sort of examining those roles in that context and saying, like, how would this play out? Taking it to weird places too. Like Henry has this sort of banter with mom's best friend, played by Sarah Silverman, that almost reads in a kind of sexual way.
Yeah, that was one of the lowlights of the movie as well.
I don't know. I kind of found that interesting though, because like he does have the mental maturity of an adult. So you sort of like look like, how would these characters actually play off each other in the real world? And it's uncomfortable, but it's also interesting and dare I say kind of charming at points. I mean, Sarah Silverman, does a very good job in this movie. But yeah, it's a weird movie, but I kind of like weird movies. So I was pretty down with it.
One thing we skipped earlier is that Henry, in his, very general genius, has decided to start playing the stock market and making what's perceived to be millions of dollars. So he's made his mom, or his family, who is kind of insinuated to be a working class family, living in this nice suburban, New York neighborhood.
Yeah.
But Susan, Henry's mom, is still hanging out with, I don't want to say lowlifes, but people who are kind of on the fringe, like Sarah Silverman, who's kind of vulgar and crass, and so that's something where he's almost trying to elevate his mom's status and trying to tell her, be a mom, but he ends up being, this patriarchal figure at 11, which is, it's weird to watch. It's different.
It is weird. It is weird. But like I said, weird can be good, and weird can be good if it's in service of something to say. And with that 60% of the movie that I liked, I think it is trying to make a statement about how we view children and how we view gifted children specifically. I think there's a tendency in these kinds of movies to romanticize that.
Certainly.
To romanticize sort of the genius 11-year-old. And this movie doesn't do that. It takes the concept of a genius 11-year-old and says, this is kind of weird and it's kind of uncomfortable. And the family dynamics really change and they really shift when you have a child who is essentially not a child. And I thought that was a very interesting and mature standpoint for a movie to take.
It kind of freaked me out towards the end of the movie because I didn't pick up early on Naomi Watts' ostensible immaturity or Susan's immaturity. I don't know what that says about me as a person, but like I saw her and I'm like, yeah, like, you know, she doesn't smoke crack and she picks the kids up from school, and it has that, you know, Spielbergian suburban feel to it. So, you know, she's modest. She could go buy a Lexus, but she sticks with her crappy station wagon. Like, I saw a lot of redeeming values about the character of Susan. However, once Henry dies, she tailspins and her insecurities and her flaws become more apparent, and she has to confront herself and change herself to either follow out Henry's dying wish or not follow out Henry's dying wish.
Like I said, it's like the movie plays like a movie about a child losing a parent, except it's the parent losing the child.
Yeah.
So around the 1 hour mark, once Henry has died, his brother discovers a journal that he left for his mom to read, and get this, outlined in the journal is a step-by-step plan to kill the neighbor abusing his stepdaughter, so that the family can adopt the stepdaughter. And he posits this to Susan from beyond the grave as sort of a way of coping with his death. He says at one point, like, it's important during the grieving process to keep busy, which I think is a logical way to treat the third act of that movie. What I don't think is very logical is creating an entire murder plot. But I didn't know what you thought of that aspect of the movie, Adam.
When I was referring earlier to the bottom falling out, this is exactly where the bottom falls out.
Yeah.
It's not that it's outside of the realm of feasibility of the narrative. It's just that it wasn't efficiently planted, and it certainly wasn't efficiently paid off. Susan's development is one of the highlights. Like, there's this great scene where she's in the kitchen, she just goes, you know, manic and makes dessert for every meal. And Peter, you know, Henry's little brother, has to bring his mom back down to earth. And she keeps saying, well, Henry would do this, Henry would want that. And Peter kind of shakes her out of her trance and says, no, not what Henry would do. What would you do, Mom? And she just freaks out. You can see this panic in her face, like, holy crap, like,
what would I do?
Yeah, exactly. I don't have a personality because Henry takes care of everything. It's almost like he enabled her bad habits. So in a sense, that did kind of plant her development and her insanity, because the idea of murdering your neighbor, not just murdering your neighbor like with poison or some untraceable thing, we're talking about with like a 50 caliber sniper rifle.
Oh yeah.
So you have to obtain illegally. Like, that was my other issue. For a genius, how does a genius kid who can, you know, consume dozens of forensic science books and you know, it's shown in the middle of the movie before he dies that he very much planned for this. Yeah. How does he come up with such an asinine, stupid plot? Like, shoot your neighbor with a sniper from the treehouse? Like, that's the part. If it was different, I could see myself getting into the third act, you know?
Yeah, and it should be noted that the third act revelation is that this was a stupid plan all along. So it's not like we were ever meant to take this seriously. But something you said really stuck with me, and it's the plausibility aspect. You know, like it all makes sense logically in terms of the characters, but the murder plot at the end of the movie, at least for me personally, felt like it belonged in a very different kind of movie. What makes Book of Henry interesting to talk about from a filmmaking standpoint is the way it deals with genre and the way it deals with genre conventions. Like the whole mom, you know, listening to her son's voice from beyond the grave to go illegally buy a sniper rifle so that she can kill her neighbor. It doesn't feel, at least from where I was standing, like it belonged in the same movie as the first half, which was a admittedly weird but relatively realistic low-key family drama. You know, it took a turn and started delving into these other genres that I don't think served the movie very well.
Yeah, I think the tone was a little too playful and juvenile for a murder neighbor by sniper rifle story arc. Yeah. There's still like a lot of cutesy family stuff that snuck in. The other thing is, it's just her decision-making process, like her decision from I'm a grieving mother to I'm going to murder my neighbor is so quick. And it's like, again, from a visual storytelling standpoint, it's her on the phone. Like, it's just this montage of her on the phone that before she thinks, oh, I can handle this, and she calls up 5 people and no one listens to her. So, okay, time to buy the rifle. Like, that was not, as a visual, it's filmmaking 101. Don't tell, show. It's characters sitting on the phone just making calls isn't particularly believable or compelling. Now, I will say the tone that would handle the abuse subplot was actually pretty good. Like the way they depicted Dean Norris's character and the Rear Window vibe where Henry and Susan get to see this happen, live. Yeah. That's the one part that I think they really handled well in terms of tone. It's just really, it's not the abuse or some of the other offensive or potentially offensive subplots. It's really just the device and the structure and plotting of how this woman goes from, like I said, grieving mother to alleged murderer. Yeah, really. I think the reason the abuse subplot doesn't feel very alien to this story is because it isn't very alien to this story. Like the dynamics with Henry and his family are very much about, the ways in which parents interact with children and children interact with parents, so having an abuse subplot in said movie doesn't feel too out of place. But like I said, if your way of addressing the abuse subplot is lure Dean Norris out into the woods with a walkie-talkie to shoot him from a treehouse, is like, no, don't. But is that even untraceable? Is that even untraceable? If someone's skull explodes, because that was what was insinuated, the rounds would explode on impact. If you're a police officer and a guy stands in the forest and he's missing his head, you see the one vantage point is the treehouse, and you're gonna find gun residue from the shells, and it's obviously gonna be, the shot's gonna have come from the treehouse. So who owns the treehouse? Oh, it's the Carpenters. The first frickin' person you interview is Susan Carpenter. I cannot get across how much A, I like a lot of this movie, and B, how unbelievably moronic that this plot actually made it into the third act. My whole thing with the murder plot, which I found particularly funny, was the whole thing is once they shoot him, his body is supposed to fall into the river so that it will go downstream and disappear. Oh, yeah. That the river is like a stream. It's like a creek. I'm sorry, but if anybody's falling in there, they're not going anywhere. Yeah, there's not even any depth. There's like 3 inches of water for most of it. If you're relying on that to get rid of your evidence, ooh. For me, I don't understand how poorly. I guess because he's a novelist, it might be with words, if you could craft explanations or get the tone right of this murder prep or this murder plan, it could have worked. But again, here's the issue with novelists writing a movie. Things are communicated differently. It has to be more streamlined. It's a movie. Yeah. And that's something that I know my one justification is perhaps this was a little rushed. In the production process, Trevorrow called up the writer and said, look, I can do this, but I have to do this absolutely right now. So the writer said he had to pull 12-hour days every day rewriting it. And with, in those cases, you might, pun intended, not see the forest through the trees. And you're fixing all the dialogue and the character beats, but you don't realize that your murder plot is literal insanity. Yeah. I mean, I watched it with my mother when I went and I rewatched it for this podcast, and one of the interesting observations she made was she was like, well, I'm sure it all works a lot better in the book. And I was like, no, it's not a book. I was like, no, this is an original screenplay. And she was like, oh, so I think you're right, Adam. I think a lot of these problems are problems because this is a movie, and because movies as a form of language, as a form of visual language, fall so heavily into genre. When you get to
dealing with hairy stuff like the murder subplot in the Book of Henry, it's a lot harder to make that work in the context of a movie because movies are so graphic. They cement their themes and they cement their ideas so concretely in images that it's really, really hard to deal with more, weird and nuanced nuanced subplots when it's all just being like laid out there for you on screen. Like I do think that might have played a little bit better as is in a book. And I think that speaks probably to Greg Hurwitz's talents as a novelist. It's just, as a screenwriter, you have to understand this is a different landscape, and this landscape abides by different rules. Like, it was funny. I was watching an interview with Colin Trevorrow. He's like, yeah, well, we basically like took the rule book and threw it out. I'm like, you very clearly did, but but that doesn't always make a good movie.
Yeah, this was very much a distinct effort to subvert and try something different. Like all of Trevorrow's films, and even from my research, some of Greg Hurwitz's novels, they like to subvert and kind of play with conventions and innovate beyond what's generally acceptable in those different genres of storytelling. And for Book of Henry, it's sad because it's so, you can feel the love for this project. And I know I said it was rushed, but it's not a very long movie to shoot. It's not the most complicated production. It was just streamlined into production. And really the reason it happened was because Trevorrow and Hurwitz and the producers behind it were so darn passionate about getting this story out. Like they cared. The one lady, I think it was Carla Hack, who came to Sidney Kimmel, who produced Book of Henry. When she came in, she said that there were only 2 projects that I care to get made in my stay as head of production. That was Hell or High Water, which was Oscar nominated in 2016. And that was produced by Taylor Sheridan, who wrote it, and then Book of Henry was the second one. And the passion, I've spent a lot of time researching this, to the detriment of my own mental health and happiness. And like, there's such genuine emotion and belief in this story, and even not just the script, but the movie Trevorrow directed. And it just didn't connect.
Yeah, it is really tragic. And it's also tragic the response it got too, because I'm of the camp that trying something new when it comes to filmmaking is I always see as a positive thing, even if it doesn't work. So
Certainly.
To see this particular movie really get dragged over the coals by the filmmaking community is depressing, because I'm like, shouldn't we be encouraging innovation? Like even the things that don't work, shouldn't we be saying, oh, but you tried, and oh, but it was interesting. Like for me, the really bad and toxic movies, at least in my opinion, are the lazy ones. They're the ones that don't make any effort to subvert genre or style. They're the ones that just use it for stupid profit gain, or use it because the writers are too lazy to come up with anything else. Like I think I would consider Book of Henry, I would consider it a modest success, just in the sense that, like, we're still talking about it almost a year later.
Sure. And I will say this, the blow that the movie has sustained has softened in the last year. It has, it still holds a fairly decent audience score, like 60-something% of Rotten Tomatoes. It has like a 6.5 on IMDb. It has great reviews on consumer platforms like Amazon or iTunes, where you can purchase the DVD or the digital copy. It seems to have some kind of impact with the more casual moviegoers, but like for the filmmaking community and for the storytellers who idolize auteurs in a certain way, a certain kind of narrative, this is like blasphemous. This kind of movie is blasphemous.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, to answer your earlier question, why it was received, with such a irate tone, is 2 words. It's Star Wars.
Yeah.
More so than any franchise, the amount of fan expectation and entitlement, that as if they are running Star Wars and they deserve to run Star Wars and they deserve to, destroy the lives or online character or the public character of the filmmakers just because they might disagree with the direction or the kinds of filmmakers that Lucasfilm and Disney hires. It's really, I like that we're addressing it. It's one of the things that kind of like hurts me very deeply about the filmmaking community, because it's meant to be a campfire or a circle where artists share. It's meant to be a place where you can watch, someone wants to tell a story and they just stumble and stutter through the whole thing, and you still pat them on the back and say, great, I never want to hear that again, but thank you for sharing, Like that's exactly the goal. And instead we just sit behind a computer and rage.
I know. Yeah. Well, it's like we need to vet the Star Wars directors like they're Secretary of State. I feel like we do vet the Star Wars directors more than we vet the Secretary of State, tragically. Because it is, I mean, like, filmmaking should be a campfire. It should be a, oh, that was interesting. Oh, I liked this. I really didn't like this. Let's try something else. Let's try something new. And I with Book of Henry, it was, it ended up falling flat, and it was like the end of the world. And it should never be the end of the world. We should always keep moving forward. Like we should be able to admire the positive aspects of something like this, while also, pointing to the things that don't work and say, like, from now on, no more Naomi Watts using a sniper rifle. Let's just check that off the list of things we don't need to see again. Good. Great.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I felt about this movie or the response to this movie that baffled me, is that for all the anger, it's not like the parts that are bad aren't grotesquely offensive. Like one reviewer said this movie was like if Spielberg was a psychopath and he directed it, and I'm just like, the murder subplot might be goofy, but it doesn't. Even for the people who saw it, like, let me just take out Star Wars from the equation. From the people who saw it, their anger, like, I went into this movie expecting to just have the most tone-deaf, grotesquely offensive characters and plot, and, like, all it was just earnest but misguided.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, too, the movie falls squarely on the camp of shooting your neighbor is not a good idea. So it's like, it's not like it's got any moral quandary. I mean, one could debate that it shouldn't have gone as far as it did, but it's not like the movie encourages this kind of behavior. The point at the end of the movie is that Henry was a child and Susan is an adult, and at the end of the day, they do need to assume those responsibilities. The point of the murder subplot being that this was always a childish thing to do, and it shouldn't have been done. So I don't think I have any moral quandary of it. I think my quandary is just like, I just don't think that plot belonged in this kind of movie. I just don't think it belonged there.
So let's talk a bit about some of the redeeming qualities and the things we liked in the Book of Henry. I want to hear your take on this.
Lee Pace's beard. Oh my gosh, Lee Pace's beard. I was astonished.
Yeah.
My mom walked away from the movie. She was like, "Oh, who is that handsome gentleman?" He was really good.
You know what's interesting? I just thought like that plays into some like fantasy tropes or some like the he's kind of like Prince Charming for this damsel in distress. That's why some of the tonal stuff feels off. Like he's the charming and effusive, ever loving doctor who does all the most generous things a doctor could ever do to a bereaved family. So that's interesting that we get some. I don't think it was a caricature, but I think like his archetype was so distinct.
It was definitely an archetype, and it's funny that you say that. There's a scene where him and Naomi Watts share like a very nice, intimate, like charming scene, like literally right before she's about to go home and try and kill the neighbor. And it's it speaks to that whole thing where it's like the positive aspects of the movie are constantly in conflict with the direction that they decide to take it at the end of the day.
Well, I know what scene you're talking about. She literally goes, she sees him at the talent show. She goes, I have parent volunteer things to do. And then she runs home and picks up her sniper rifle. Like, it's just one of the most weirded, upstaged moments in terms of character development.
I would say on the whole, the Doctor was a positive element, totally. as was Sarah Silverman. I think Colin Trevorrow has a real knack when it comes to minor characters. We saw that in Jurassic World too. He's really good at like taking people who are relegated to the background in these kinds of stories and making them interesting enough to be their own,
certainly,
to be their own main characters. And I think this movie does a pretty good job of that.
Well, that's one of the things that I disagree with a lot of people when they say Trevorrow doesn't know how to cultivate character. Because some of my favorite moments, I mean, well, let me say Jurassic was a little flat for me. I've been pretty vocal about that when it comes to character. However, safety not guaranteed, and especially now, Book of Henry has just amazing direction and character moments, even if they're misplaced in the greater narrative. Like some of the stuff with Jacob Tremblay or Naomi Watts, it just broke my heart early on, or at least it made me feel such deep things that if the movie had earned or better placed those moments, I think all the characters were very well defined. Like coming out of the movie, sometimes I'll look back like with Jurassic World and just be this fog of humans, like there were people and they did things and there was a dinosaur, you have that kind of thick strata of ambiguity. But with Book of Henry, I could recall each person and where they were coming from. And that is something really special to do as a filmmaker. So one of the other things I really liked about the movie was the visual presentation, the kind of aesthetic qualities. The producers and the filmmakers were very clear that they wanted this to feel like a memory. It was supposed to be immortalized as if it was uncovered from the past. That's probably why your mom said, "Oh, so what was the book like?" Or the book was probably better, right? Because this does feel like some ancient fable. And one of the decisions they made was to keep as little technology as possible in the movie so that it felt like it could have happened. Like the camera Henry uses is a film camera. It's something that was around in the 80s. So, and the treehouse is very vintage. So everything is designed to have a warmth and texture to it. And that's the reason they shot it on film. And I mean, for me, what they did with the visuals was breathtaking for the kind of film that it was.
Yeah, I don't know if ancient's the right word, but it definitely felt of a different time period. It definitely felt timeless just in terms of the design and the look. It felt very Amblin-esque. I thought there was a lot of the qualities and motifs that you saw in Spielberg movies of the 80s and 90s, like Robert Zemeckis movies as well. And I thought that was very intentional because I think the majority of the movie exists to take a lot of the kinds of characters and the kinds of tropes that were in those movies and recontextualize them and re-examine them.
Yeah, I gotta give major props to both the cinematographer and the production designer, but specifically John Schwartzman, who shot this movie. He shot some really good looking movies like Seabiscuit, and when you unleash him to do his thing, like I think in Book of Henry, you get these beautiful images and contrast of shadows and color, which I think is very distinct. It has this just like organic shine to it. And that's why it definitely sells the first half, the novelty of like the first half of the movie as a family drama, as something that was almost of a Spielberg era. Because we all know Trevorrow has worked closely and, cites Spielberg as one of his biggest influences.
Admires him a lot.
Yeah. I think like, I almost wonder if I saw this movie 10 years ago as, a 12 or 13-year-old. I wonder what my reaction would be to seeing like the treehouse and some of the devices these kids play with. Because like, when you're in your backyard and you're young, you when you're with your friends, you imagine what Henry has because he's a genius. He built it all. So there was some parts that so brilliantly activated my inner child and kind of facilitated that urban, community-centric vibe that we got with the Carpenters.
Yeah, I'm gonna echo your sentiment about the shots. I think there's a lack of planning when it comes to shots in movies nowadays. And the reason, again, part of the reason I don't really count Book of Henry as a failure is just because there's way too much talent behind the camera for me to ignore. Like there's this shot where the three of them are at a grocery store and you see Susan like pushing the cart along and Jacob Tremblay's, 6-year-old boy character is like taking all this stuff off the shelf and putting it in the cart, like Diet Coke and Twinkies and whatnot. And then like every time he does, like Henry's like taking it out and putting it back on the shelf and putting in things they need. And they're having a conversation about something completely unrelated, but from a visual standpoint, you're saying a lot about who those three characters are. And that kind of thoughtfulness is sadly missing in better movies.
It's like you said, like he acts like the parent. It's not Susan who's taking out all the candy and Coke and all the chocolate crap.
It's like she couldn't care less.
Yeah. She's just this passive parent. And I've seen passive parenting before. It's difficult because, parents have lives as well. And kids are exhausting and they have to work and parents have to, wear 5 hats at once. So like I've seen this a lot where parents kind of just dial in on cruise control at a pretty low speed. And like I said, they don't commit grotesque offenses. They don't leave their kids in the hood overnight, or they don't, forget to pick up their kids or get drunk and hit their kids or whatever. But it's kind of like this, I will exist with you, but I'm not going to mentor and foster your development. And that's really sad. And sometimes it goes hidden because it seems like the parents are competent,
I know. Yeah. So it is actually interesting that the movie decided to touch on that element of parenting, which is not always present, but can sometimes be somewhat insidious.
And I think that's why some people connect with this movie more than others. Like I've gone on Twitter and, gone through the reviews, and 90% of the reviews are either 1 star or 5 stars. And, I scroll through Twitter, it's either like, 5 out of 5 or 10 out of 10. Like I watched this with my husband and we cried the way through it. What a stirring movie. It's the best movie I've seen this year. And the other one is like, I will, file a class action lawsuit if Travar was allowed to touch a camera ever again. Like literally, these are things I've read. This is not me making it up. So I think there's a bit for everyone in this movie, and it's kind of dependent on the individual if they grasp onto the good things and kind of overlook the flaws like some people really seem to do. So before we close out, I'd like to just briefly touch on a final verdict and assign a rating to the film. It's something we didn't get to do last time with Star Wars The Last Jedi. I still like to give a final verdict. I like, there are a lot of elements, and it's very important to discuss all the different parts, the characters, the story, the tone, the cinematography, and take what's good or discuss what's good and bad. But I do kind of believe, a film is supposed to all coalesce into a seamless story that is presented to the audience. So like, I like receiving that, and acknowledging that. For me, it's difficult. Like you said, I would love to give this movie more credit and to have loved that 20 or 30 or 40%. It was a huge detractor, so for me, I'm probably going to settle on a 3 out of 5.
Yeah, I'm going to settle on a 3 out of 5 as well. Normally, I would do 2.5, but like I said, I admire the attempt to do something different, and maybe that's just because I'm a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because I like trying things, but it's a quality that I definitely want to see more of in Hollywood. So yeah, 3 out of 5 stars for me. So next week, we're going to be talking about a similarly ambitious movie, Mute. It's directed by Duncan Jones, and it's released exclusively on Netflix. Similar to Book of Henry, I think this is one that tries a lot of new and interesting things to varying levels of success, but will make for a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it follows in the trend of small directors who blow up fast and then borderline self-destruct with their own passion projects. Like Mute was a in the works for a long time as a passion project of Duncan Jones. He's actually David Bowie's son, by the way. So he comes from a very artistically rich background. And, he did Warcraft and kind of got handed the keys to the kingdom, pun intended again. Me and my dad jokes. This is terrible. But it's something where, again, I can see ambitious intention laid bare and something that was maliciously received. So I want to get into that and also kind of break down what Duncan Jones was trying to do, because just like Book of Henry, I think there's a lot of redeeming qualities to that movie.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to talk too about the format it was released on. I mean, this is an exclusively Netflix movie, whereas Book of Henry got a wide release. So we'll also be talking a little bit too about, you know, the trends Netflix seems to follow when they make movies, what their approach to filmmaking is, how that's different than, say, theatrical movies, whether that's different in a good way. So yeah, it's going to be very exciting.
So thank you for joining us this week on The Home Experience. We look forward to seeing you next time and hopefully for many times to come. I'm Adam Barnard.
I'm Jackson Smith.
And we'll see you next time.